Let's get started. I'm very honored to be joining you tonight, and I was delighted when Elvesa asked me to do so. We had some discussion about the topic for tonight's presentation and decided that really talking about some of the problems about ever-changing nutrition advice might be an interesting place to start, because I find that health professionals and nurses in particular are frequently being asked the question about the confusing messages that the world is confronted with in terms of nutrition. This is a picture of a bookshop I went into in Melbourne recently, in fact, before the lockdown. And this shows you about 1/3 of the books that are present in this very large bookshop in Melbourne. And it's hardly surprising, is it, when you see this collection of books that tells you about nutrition, that the public are immensely confused by what they are presented with. And what I'm going to try and do tonight is to make a small attempt to give you some idea of what you should say to your patients when they ask you questions about nutrition. Now, some of you may recognize this man. This man is Mr. Nelson Mandela. And at the same time that I took those slides in Melbourne, Australia, I went to an exhibition in Melbourne of the life of this man who liberated South Africa from the apartheid regime. And he managed to know that this was Mr. Nelson Mandela, whom I have never met, but I saw an exciting exhibition about his life in Australia when I visited there before lockdown. And this man who liberated South Africa from the apartheid regime lived to be 94 or 93 years of age, despite the fact that for 30 years, he was imprisoned by the South African regime. And he lived on a... I want to show you, if you look at that panel C, you'll see what this man lived on for 30 years. He was living on maize meal, a protein drink, a small amount of fat, some maize, and a moderate amount of meat. And that was what he was living on for 30 years. And despite that, he remained healthy and lived for 90 years. And now I'm frozen again, but it seems to be stalling. Anyway, moving ahead now. Very different from what people are eating in the UK and the USA. There's a typical UK and USA family in terms of what they are eating over a typical week. And an Ecuadorian and a Mali family, what they're eating for a week. And what I'm really trying to illustrate is that people do seem to manage to survive on a large number of different dietary patterns. And in fact, many of the people on those dietary patterns remain healthy. So the first message I want to leave you with is there's not one pattern that seems to be compatible not only with human survival, but with human good health. Now, really, until very recently, until about 50 or 60 years ago, appropriate nutrition was really defined very simply. It was simply a case of having sufficient calories, sufficient protein, and sufficient vitamins, minerals, trace elements, and essential fatty acids. And on that particular program, healthy diets were planned. But something really extraordinary started to happen in the 1950s to the health of populations. And it started in Western countries particularly, but it is now a problem that one sees worldwide. And what was apparent, starting, as I say, in the Western countries in the 1950s and 1960s, was rapidly increasing rates of coronary heart disease. And coronary heart disease, of course, has always occurred. There's always been a problem of coronary heart disease, but it was never apparent at the increasing rates that started in the 1960s. And there was a very considerable amount of evidence to suggest that saturated fat and cholesterol in the blood as a result of the saturated fat was an important factor in the increasing of these rates. Now, I know there's a considerable amount of literature which says that saturated fat and cholesterol are not important. There is not, unfortunately, time tonight, but I'm very happy if there's time for questions, despite the delays that we've had, to argue for the evidence. But I'll show you what I think is really pretty impressive evidence, just one little bit of evidence. As a result of the evidence that was produced, populations were recommended to reduce the total unsaturated fat and to increase the amount of complex carbohydrate in the diet. And as a result of this, in many, many Western countries, you saw a pattern, as I show you on this particular slide, increasing from the beginning of this era, the 1950s, and then up into the 1960s, reaching a peak which differed from country to country. I've just shown you the New Zealand rates here. This is death rates, but the same applies to rates of incidence of coronary heart disease. Some countries peaked in the 1960s, some in the 1970s, and in some countries, the rate is still going up. But basically, in Western countries, what you saw was a steady decline of coronary heart disease in parallel with the reduction of saturated fat that occurred in the diet of those countries. Now, the problem that has arisen, and again, some countries are behind many of the Western countries in this respect. Despite the falling rates of coronary heart disease, there were increasing rates of obesity and diabetes. And I'm going to expand on these increasing rates of obesity and diabetes because, as I think everybody who is around this webinar tonight knows, that obesity and diabetes are really epidemics in the world now. And of course, in some countries, of many countries, we're dealing with epidemics or the pandemic of COVID. But as a rumbling on in the background, we have got this problem of obesity and diabetes. And when we eventually conquer COVID, obesity and diabetes are once again going to be the diseases which are the greatest problem diseases facing us. And of course, as many of us know, obesity and diabetes are some of the most important predictors of a poor outcome of the COVID epidemic. I've mentioned as the third bullet point also awareness of links between diet and cancer, because this is important too. And I think we are very clear now that apart from cigarette smoking, obesity, intake of red and processed meats, lack of fiber, and lack of fruit and vegetables are very important causes of a number of different cancers. But although these cancers are very important, they don't seem to be increasing at the same rates that obesity and diabetes are facing the world in terms of epidemic proportions. You don't really need me to tell you in any detail about the epidemic of obesity. This is really showing a summary of the OECD figures for obesity, as well as some non-OECD countries in the bottom panel. And if one really just very simply looks at the left-hand panel, which is in light blue and dark blue, depending upon whether data are self-reported or whether the data have been measured in surveys, you can see this enormous difference in obesity in a country like Japan, for example, at the lower end, a country like Korea, which has relatively little obesity, going up to the terrible, terrible statistics of New Zealand, Mexico, and the United States, just using the measured data. And of course, not only do we see this terrific series of figures worldwide, but as you all know, obesity rates are increasing in almost every country in the world, other than in some of these miraculously low incidence countries or low frequency countries. And of course, in parallel with these increasing rates of obesity, we've got this global epidemic of diabetes. And it really is scary when you look and see how many countries are in the dark red or very dark red category, with horrific figures of 10, 12% or more of populations with diabetes. And again, the rates are increasing rapidly. Not only do we have these high-risk countries, but of course, within countries, you see populations that are very different. And I just show you as an example, the figures from the country in which I live now. I've lived in New Zealand for about 30 years. I lived in England before that. But you see a very similar pattern in England and in many of the countries that you represent tonight. You can see this really striking picture I show you here how levels have increased between 2005 and 2015. And you can see 4 population groups that live in New Zealand. The x-axis, and I'm sorry, the axis, the bottom axis has fallen away, but that's the age category. So obviously diabetes prevalence is very low in the youngest age group, increases around the 60s and 70s. And you can see in the European population of New Zealand, rates have increased, but nothing like they have increased in the Māori, the indigenous people of New Zealand, and in the Asian populations of New Zealand, which are both of Chinese ethnicity and Indian ethnicity, as well as the population that comes from the Pacific Islands. So the point that I'm making is, although those figures that I showed on the previous slide, showing the geographic variation, in almost every country, there is also an enormous ethnic difference with some populations, as you can see, people in the Pacific Islands, something like 50% of the Pacific population of New Zealand, and indeed the islands themselves, by the time they get to 60, 65 years of age, 50% of them actually have diabetes. So with this picture that I've tried to paint, what do we do about it? Well, that's really the second half of my talk, and I hope I'm not talking too quickly, but I'm trying to get through my talk fairly speedily so that we do have time for discussion despite the delayed start. Now, this man that you see in front of you is somebody that I'm sure many of you have heard of. This man is Dr. Atkins of the Atkins high-fat diet. And Dr. Atkins believed, he's now deceased, but he believed that the cause of all this problem that we were seeing in terms of obesity and diabetes, and of course, I needn't remind you, because I'm sure you are all very well aware, that diabetes is not just a disease of high blood glucose. It is one of the most important causes now that we have of coronary heart disease in middle-aged and older people. It's one of the most important causes of adult blindness, one of the most important causes of non-traumatic amputation. So we are talking about a pretty terrible condition. Dr. Atkins suggested that the solution to obesity and diabetes would be pretty much eating as little carbohydrate as you possibly could. And the low carbohydrate movement has taken off worldwide. You can see the front page of Time magazine a few years ago, meat-loving, bread-banning regimes of the rage. Do they work? Are they healthy? Here's the skinny, here's the truth. The Time magazine was going to tell us the truth. The Guardian, if you happen to be living in the United Kingdom, high carb or high fat, the running debate. So what I would like to do now is really to show you what the arguments are for the high carbohydrate diet, apart from Dr. Atkins' smiling face. What are the arguments put forward for the, sorry, did I say the high carbohydrate? I mean the high fat diet. What are the arguments for saying reduce carbohydrate and eat more fat? My patients come to me pretty much every day. Somebody will ask me, surely I should be on a diet which is low in carbohydrate. Well, this series of arguments that I'm going to present to you now was published about 5 years ago, and really was the argument for restricting carbohydrate in people with diabetes, but it's the same argument that is used for restricting carbohydrate in the population as a whole. And I want to show you this particular paper, which was published in a very reputable journal, but I also wanted to show you the what is in the panel at the bottom of this slide, which says funding was received from, amongst other sources, the Atkins Foundation, the Global Dairy Platform, McDonald's, Jenny Craig, and the Low Carb Meal Replacement Company. So many of the papers advertising the low carb diet has come from people that have received funding from institutions or organizations which have vested commercial or other interests in the low carbohydrate approach. Well, let me show you what the arguments are. Here's the first argument. There are a whole lot of arguments. Here's the first argument. As you can see in that little inset box on the top left-hand side of the big box, that is the increase in the United States of people with diabetes. A dramatic increase from the 1970s to the mid-1990s, people with diabetes. And what you can see there is in the first line, the calorie intake has gone up. That's the first line. The second line, carbohydrate intake has gone up, and fat intake has really gone up very little, and saturated fat almost not at all in comparison with the increase in carbohydrate. So the argument goes, it must be increased carbohydrate causing increased calories that is putting up the obesity rates and diabetes. Then another interesting finding, a collection of studies which show that low carbohydrate diets result in a greater weight loss in people with type 2 diabetes than those who are recommended simply a healthy eating weight loss diet. And again, there are studies not only in people with diabetes, but in the population at large. Then, this is, of course, diabetes, and we know how many people there are with diabetes, and you will know that hemoglobin A1c is a way of monitoring the diabetes control. You can see that the ordinary low-calorie diet produces weight loss, but produces a drop in hemoglobin A1c, but nothing like you've got on a very low-carbohydrate ketogenic diet. So the evidence looks stronger and stronger, doesn't it? And then we all know the importance of lipids. Well, the importance of lipids you can see in this slide, and I won't spend too much time taking you the details, but the low carb diet is the one in red, and the other diets are a various collection of diets that are not particularly low in carbohydrate. And what you can see is, as we've already looked at, that the weight loss is greater on the low carbohydrate diet. The hemoglobin A1c improves more on the low carbohydrate diet. So does glucose. And triglycerides improve dramatically on the low carbohydrate diet. And indeed, HDL goes up on the low carbohydrate. There's also a little increase in LDL, which we may or may not have time to come back to before the end of this discussion. So I'm sure you would agree that these findings look very persuasive. Well, is there a problem with these findings? And I would submit to you there are two problems with not only these data that I've shown you, but virtually every other comparable set of data shown in many other papers. So let me show you what I think are the problems with this argument. Well, what you see in front of you, and I'm sorry it looks rather complicated diagram, but it's actually got a very simple message, and I'll take you through it. This is a paper published by some of my Norwegian colleagues and myself, and it looks to see in the first box, the top box, it looks at the different studies that have been rather short term, that have been conducted for a period of between 3 and 6 months. And what you can see from this panel is that it really does look as if body weight is reduced And that diamond at the bottom shows you that it looks as if there is definitely a reduction in body weight in those 9 or however many studies there are that have been undertaken in the short term. However, if you look at those studies that have been continued for 12 months or longer, there is really no benefit whatsoever over any other form of eating from a low carbohydrate diet. So it appears to be a short-term effect on body weight. And similarly, if you look at changes in hemoglobin A1c, you can see even more strikingly, if you compare the top collection of studies with a bottom collection of studies and just compare the diamonds, which are the summary statistics, that yes, definitely, for under 6 months, it looks as if these studies are doing something good. But if you look at the bottom one, you'll see there is really nothing going much for hemoglobin A1c in the long term. So my first summary point in relation to these low carb diets are that they seem only to be beneficial in the short term. There is no data from controlled studies. There are data from uncontrolled studies, but no data from controlled studies that they're beneficial. Then there is another issue, which is every bit, if not more important, and that is what I really wanted to emphasize tonight, and that is, what do we mean when we talk about carbohydrate? And you may remember, or you may not remember, from one of my very first slides I showed you, I was making the point that before the 1950s, carbohydrates weren't even mentioned. There was no mention of carbohydrates in those slides. There was calories, there was protein, there was vitamins, minerals, essential fatty acids, but carbohydrates were simply regarded as calories that were needed to make up the total number of calories that people required. There's a very different situation now. Carbohydrates are a lot of very different things. And as you can see here, I show an example of bread. There is bread in the top left-hand panel, which is very dense, high fiber, whole wheat bread, whole grain bread. That's rather typical of Northern Europe or Scandinavia. In the right-hand panel, you see white bread, which is very, very rapidly digested carbohydrate. Carbohydrate that in fact is no different after it's been eaten than eating a bag of glucose, quite frankly. These are also carbohydrates, very different carbohydrates. These are slowly digested carbohydrate. Much of the digestion takes place in the large bowel. And as far as metabolism is concerned, the metabolic processes are very, very different from that white bread and doubly different from sugar. So what about rice? Well, rice is a very important carbohydrate in many parts of the world. Some of you may have seen this BMJ, which was published a long time ago. Now, I think it was 2002, if I can see correctly. What's the link between white rice and diabetes? We know that diabetes is very common, particularly in the Indian subcontinent, and white rice consumption is common. Well, fascinating story for white rice. If you look at Western populations, this is similar to the forest plots I showed you earlier on, you can see that in Western populations, it looks as if white rice does somewhat increase the risk of type 2 diabetes in people that eat a lot of white rice. In Asian populations, and this is entirely based really on a couple of studies in Japan and Shanghai. There are some data from India, but they didn't fulfill the criteria for getting into this study. It really does look as if large consumptions of white rice are very important risk factors for type 2 diabetes. Well, this starts to present problems, doesn't it? Particularly for rice-eating populations. This is a study done by one of my PhD students quite a while ago now, and actually looking at the blood glucose responses to glucose to different varieties of rice. And if one looks at glycemic index, which is simply an indication of the extent to which glucose rises in comparison with taking glucose, just a load of glucose, you can see that jasmine rice, for example, has a GI which is appreciably higher than for basmati rice and for parboiled rice. And I haven't got an example here of ordinary white rice that you buy in a British supermarket or a New Zealand or an Australian supermarket, where the GI seems to be even higher than the jasmine rice. It can be well over 70. So interesting findings, I think. Going to show you one more set of background slides, and then we'll try and put the story together in the last few minutes. If we're thinking about a low carbohydrate diet, are there some things that we're losing out on in a low carbohydrate diet? Well, we know that in some fruits and vegetables, we know that there are some vitamins and there's some minerals, and there's some good foods apart from carbohydrate in the fruits and vegetables. But what I think many people have not realized is just how important dietary fiber is as a protective nutrient. This is a paper that we published, done by Andrew Reynolds, who's one of my colleagues, published in the Lancet last year. And you can see from this that there is a remarkable protective effect of dietary fiber in the top left-hand panel of all-cause mortality, a dramatic protection effect of type 2 diabetes, and a dramatic effect in protecting against colorectal cancer. Let me just show you how striking this is. If you look at the high versus low intakes of fiber, the relative risk reduction for all-cause mortality, coronary heart disease mortality, coronary heart disease incidence, type 2 diabetes, colorectal cancer, mortality from cancer, dramatic improvement in all these outcomes for people who have high intakes of fiber. What is a high intake of fiber? Well, the benefit starts to be seen well above 25 grams of fiber a day, which is well above what certainly people in Western countries are eating, and very well above, indeed, not just slightly above, and almost, well, not almost impossible to achieve if somebody chooses to have a low carbohydrate diet. Not only does fiber improve those diseases, but fiber improves, helps body weight reduction, cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, blood pressure, hemoglobin A1c, glucose, insulin resistance, all unachievable on a low carbohydrate diet. And one of the most striking findings of all, and I'd love to spend an hour talking about this, but I only want to spend another few minutes, is really talking about if you have people at risk of diabetes, such as people with pre-diabetes in Finland, and you do a randomized controlled trial, such was done in the Finnish diabetes prevention study, which has now had something like 15 to 20 years follow-up with continuing results of this kind. And you put people onto a diet where you encourage them to lose weight, not a lot of weight, at least 5% of body weight. So if you have somebody who's overweight at 100 kilograms, you're only asking them to lose 5 kilograms or more, plenty of fiber, reduced fat, reduced saturated fat, and have some physical activity. You can dramatically reduce the risk of people with pre-diabetes going on to diabetes in the long term. And what this graph is showing you is the outcome. Admittedly, this is in the first 5 years, but the outcome, as I've said, the benefits continue for between 10 to nearly 20 years. If people do all those 5 things that I've listed on the right-hand panel, very, very few people go on to get diabetes in that period of follow-up. For people that don't follow any of those goals, over 35% of them will go on to get diabetes in the first few years. So The point that I'm trying to make is that the low-carb diet really has no evidence whatsoever associated with it for long-term benefit. But I'm starting to really try and get my message across that we've got profoundly impressive evidence that in the short to medium term, we can do something about these epidemics of type 2 diabetes and obesity, as well as the epidemic of coronary heart disease, which is really what is killing people prematurely and causing premature morbidity in our population. So what do we know in summary? What am I trying to say in summary? Well, we know that, yes, we do need certain nutrients. What I said to you right at the beginning, those requirements are still there. We need our vitamins and minerals and our essential fatty acids and our protein. But there are some foods and nutrients which are promotive of the epidemic diseases of the 21st century. And I've listed those in the right-hand panel, and they're those that are protective. Trans fats, which are there in a large number of manufactured foods, saturated fat, processed meats, high intake of red meat, those are the cancer ones, excess of salt intake, excess alcohol I haven't talked about, and the rapidly digested starches and sugars. Those carbohydrates that are really the bad carbohydrates that probably were giving carbohydrates the bad press that I talked about earlier on. Fiber and whole grains, fantastically protective. Unsaturated fatty acids, such as you find in fish and nuts, protective. And of course, vegetables and fruits, which are sources of vitamins, particularly, as well as fiber, are immensely protective nutrients. So what is our overarching message? Well, our overarching message is the one I've already given you. It is low in saturated fats, high in all these healthy foods that I've illustrated there, and high in the whole grains. And the message for rice-eating countries, I believe, is to be trying to work towards a diet which is based on the more traditional diet, which is a more varied variety of grains, and where possible, the low glycemic index variety of grains, of rice. Because I think there is no doubt that in the modern world, eating large amounts of highly polished, highly processed white rice is a problem. And I acknowledge that that is very difficult in many of the Asian high rice eating countries. So to conclude, having said that we really want to encourage people to eat food that is as little processed and as little packaged as possible, what do we do about the packaged foods that are such an important part of the diet of so many of our countries, regardless of where we live? And I think one of the biggest difficulties for people like me and people who are interested in public health nutrition is how we get the message across for packaged foods. And just in my last couple of slides, I want to show you how difficult this is. This is the traffic light system, which is in use in the United Kingdom, which basically says a green message is good, a sort of amber or orangey colored one is intermediate, and red is for danger. And you can see here's a collection of Kellogg cereals, which look pretty good in terms of saturated and total fat. They're quite low, but they're high in sugars and salt. So makes it pretty difficult for a consumer, doesn't it? Because the consumer says, oh, well, here's two good things, but there's one pretty bad thing in this cereal, and there's one that's, you know, quite bad. So what can we do better? Well, the Australians came up with a pretty good, and New Zealand adopted it, conceptually a pretty good thing. They said, let's give people a composite rating. And there are other composite ratings. There's the key, you know, to open the lock, which is used in some other countries. And this one was a really interesting one, which got a lot of attention worldwide. And the idea was to look at saturated fat, sugar, sodium, and fiber. And I think we'd all agree that these are very important. These are very important nutrients. And as you can see, this collection in this particular system comes up with a 4 health star rating, and that's 4 out of 5. So 4 out of 5 for a breakfast cereal looks very good. But there's a but, and that is the way the system is calculated, the fact that this is high in fiber and not too bad in sodium and pretty good in saturated fat neutralizes the fact that it's disastrously high in sugar. So although conceptually this is good, actually, in fact, if you want to cut down on your calories and you want to cut down on your rapidly digested carbohydrate, well, it's not really so good. So if we want to come up with a composite message, we've got to try and do better. And this one shows another example of the confusion. And that is, people like me have been talking for years about how good dietary fiber is. And whole grain, we know, is a source of dietary fiber. But the food industry is very clever. The food industry knows that and knows that the whole grain message for health has got across. But there's a catch. Whole grains, the definition of whole grains, do not exclude a whole grain that is highly processed. So you can have a whole grain which contains all the ingredients of the grain, but is very, very highly processed, does not confer the same health benefits as a whole grain product that is truly whole grain. And I think the biggest challenge that we've got in nutrition now is to come out with how on earth we're going to advise people as to how to choose packaged foods, because we haven't got that system right yet. So for the moment, all we can do is, one more slide before I summarize, and that is to say, there's also been a lot of interest in glycemic index. Well, glycemic index can be very good. A very bad glycemic index is close to 100 because it means that the glucose response is no different from a drink of glucose, the blood glucose. So here you see some chickpeas on the left. Their glycemic index is 38, looks wonderful. But Nutella, which is one of the most calorie containing, it's got some nuts in, which is good, but it is very high in calories, very high in sugar. That's also got a low glycemic index. And to make matters worse, you can now buy low glycemic index sugar. How ridiculous can you get? Low glycemic index sugar has got some coating on it, but it is absolutely no different in calories from white sugar. So the message comes back to the fact that our message really has to be a mixed diet, which is not necessarily low in carb, but has the right kind of carbs, which is as little processed as possible. When it comes to processed foods and packaged foods, really the only way one can, in the light of current packaging, is to try and train people to read the labels that are at the back rather than the front of the packaging, where the truth prevails. But frankly, the average person will find that very difficult. And for people like me, the biggest challenge now is to work out how we can try and explain to people how they can make food choices. But please, my message is, don't be conned by people that say stop eating carbohydrate. Eat the right kind of carbohydrate. Tell that to your patients, and tell your patients to go as far as possible for unpackaged, minimally processed food. I wish I could have ended with a useful bit of information about packaged foods, but I'd be really interested to hear. I'm sorry we've gone on a bit long, but I haven't actually exceeded my time because we started late. Be very interested to hear from people who are participating, whether in your countries you have actually got something better to advise people as to how they should choose packaged foods. So with that, I shall end, and I shall stop screen sharing, and hopefully we got a little bit of time, Alvesta, for discussion, even though we're running late, but that's up to you.
Okay. Here we are trying to work with Health Canada. We are trying to ask the company to change their format of packaging, because right now, especially the children, they're attracted with because the packaging usually they use the different characters, cartoon characters to attract, you know, the children to buy it. Okay. So now we are trying to ask the Health Canada Health Canada is asking the company, for example, the General Mills who produces those Kellogg's or those rice cereal, to cooperate with Health Canada to make the packaging more clear for the parents, and it should be like identify how many sugar in that the contents of that food. Okay, so that's the one that we are still in the process of dealing with those food manufacturer to try to like educate them to cooperate with the Health Canada to to say like a public awareness to reduce making lots of advertisement of using those famous character, and also try to educate the public on how to read the labels, because most of the public they have difficulty in understanding the labels. And I think for me, I think like my suggestion is that if they can make it more simple to understand, because sometimes those people who are doesn't even know what is monosaccharides, what is polysaccharide, they don't understand that. So make those word maybe into a simple understandable thing for those majority of the population that doesn't have any how to call this ideas about those terms that I just mentioned.
Yeah.
So I don't know.
Yeah, I think obviously you make a very important point. I think trying to encourage people, manufacturers, not to make packaging attractive, you know,
Yes.
and
Yes.
also to encourage, one of the things that really distresses me is sports people who are heroes in so many countries.
That's right.
They advertise unhealthy
That's right.
food.
Yeah.
That is terrible. But
Yeah.
I really do think that the challenge, and there is a lot of work going on, is really to try and get something simple, particularly, I mean, breakfast cereal for countries where there is a lot of breakfast cereal would be very helpful, to try and come up with a model. And there's a lot of work being done in Australia on this. I'm not involved in it, but I know that people are working on it, to try and come up with something like a star rating that I mentioned, which doesn't allow you to get a high star rating by simply putting in a lot of fiber to counter the sugar, if you see what I mean. You can make up a mathematical formula which says to get a high rating, you should have high fiber, low salt, low saturated fat, without too much sugar. But of course, the one way of compensating for putting in more fiber, for example, is putting in a lot of sugar. And Kellogg's All Bran is a very good example. For people who know those Kellogg cereals, and they're all over the world, I mean, All Bran was a wonderful source of, has always been a very good source of fiber. If you've got a patient who's constipated, having Kellogg's All Bran is wonderful. But in the old Kellogg's All Bran, you had to have an enormous amount of sugar, because they put sugar in to make it taste nice, so that you didn't have the bitter taste of the fiber. Now, they've improved that product. They've reduced the sugar, but there's still quite a lot of sugar in there. So I think if one could come up with a symbol that said, you know, 5 stars is wonderful, 1 star is not good, it is possible to do that. But I think that getting rid of sports people advertising and making children's cartoons and that kind of thing,
that's right. Yes,
children want it, like you're doing in Canada, I think it's got to be a combination of that. I did see one person, I was looking at the chat while I was talking at the same time, and somebody said, give us 3 takeaway messages. Did you, I don't know who that was, who said, which I think was...
Thank you for excellent presentation. With COVID, everybody has woken up. In United Kingdom, 13% of people are Black and ethnic minority. 38% people who died are Black and ethnic minority because of diabetes, obesity, hypertension, lifestyle, and everything. Only 2% of white people got diabetes, and 10% Asians have diabetes. So now everybody has woken up. And I really enjoyed your presentation. Obesity is a huge problem worldwide. India has got only 5% obesity. United Kingdom has got 28%. USA 38%. Now people have woken up. And I really liked your message. I want you to take us through, because I got diabetes, got a family, I'm Asian, and I'm now doing regular exercise. And I'm really now controlling my weight in a big way. I should have started 10 years ago when I was a child. I always said we got to educate the children for healthy living so that we do not have lifestyle diseases.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think you've said so much in those few minutes. I appreciate what you say. And of course, I mean, I've spent much of my life working in the UK, so I know exactly the situation that you're describing. And I mean, it really, I think my three messages would be, number one, start with children. And I couldn't agree more. It's really got to be start with children. But as far as the messages would be concerned, I would say limit processed foods as much as possible, because it is so difficult to get healthy processed foods. So limit processed foods, eat the right kind of carbohydrate. When you're eating carbohydrate, it must be the right kind of carbohydrate, because there's so much wrong carbohydrate consumed. Particularly with replies to bread. People think they're eating brown bread and it's healthy. Brown bread is not necessarily healthy. If you're going to eat bread, it's got to be very dense whole grain bread, and reduce saturated fat, I think, is another very important message. And if one eats the right kind of carbohydrate and reduces saturated fat, people tend not to eat that much unsaturated fat if you limit that. I think that's going to help control your weight, and of course sugar. But you know, that's part of eating the right carbohydrate. It would make a huge difference.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. Thank you.
I have another question. How about the sugar from the fruit? Do you think we limit the amount of pieces? Like, for example, watermelon. I know that there is lots of sugar in that. Do you try to limit the amount of, you know?
I did have a patient once, Elvesa, who told me that the only fruit that they like is watermelon. So I said, how much watermelon do you have? And the patient said, watermelon. And she said, I eat a whole watermelon. Well, obviously, if you're going to eat a whole watermelon, you're going to eat a lot of sugar. But on the whole, if you have a slice of watermelon, it's not going to have that much sugar. I think there are very few fruits that really need to be limited. I think if you've got diabetes, grapes are one of the fruits that have got a lot of glucose in them. So grapes and ripe bananas are, you know, if you have those soggy, I don't like them, but there's, you know, the very jelly-like bananas when they get very ripe. They are very high in sugar. But on the whole, I do not recommend a reduction of fruit, because fruit is got so many good things in it that I don't think fruit needs to be recommended. It needs to be disadvantaged. Perhaps the one exception is dried fruit. You know, the dried fruits are very concentrated forms. Dried apricot or any kind of dried fruit is very concentrated. And I wouldn't recommend it, certainly for diabetic patients, I would not recommend it. But on the whole, I don't recommend a reduction of fruit.
Okay, thank you. Is there another question for Dr. Mann? Hello? I have one last one. Hello? Dr. Mann, I have one. What do you mean by low carbohydrate ketogenic diet?
Low carbohydrate ketogenic is a very low carbohydrate diet, which many people are recommending. They're commercial companies, and they just about in every country, in every sort of, certainly in Europe, in many countries, Australia, the United States, Canada, commercial companies that try to tell you you should start off getting carbohydrate down to to no more than 20 grams a day. And that
Okay.
makes you ketogenic. And when your ketone levels go up, it makes you slightly nauseous and reduces your appetite. And it
Okay.
does result in initial weight loss, but there is no evidence that it results in long-term weight loss.
Okay. Thank you. Any other question? Hello?
Yeah. Hello.
So, you know what? I thank you so much, Dr. Mann. I know I'm so thankful because it's already evening in your time, and you are so generous to to join us, because I think it's already almost 10 o'clock in the evening, right? In your
No,
place.
it's fine. I have many activities at night with COVID now, so.
So that's why I said, oh my God, thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I wish you well with the rest of your conference.
Thank
Okay, bye. Bye.
you.
Thanks, bye.